Hi. Welcome everybody. Today's lesson deals with independent and dependent variables. We're also talking about what we call functional relationships. Alright. So, on your notes, you have a definition that's given to you. A function is a consistent, predictable relationship between a dependent variable, which we usually call y, and an independent variable we usually call x. Functions let us find the value of the dependent variable if we know what the value of the independent variable is. All right, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that, especially on Friday. But we want to kind of go through what is an independent and what is a dependent variable when we talk about a functional relationship. So, we have an example here. Get your cool tunes from Music Mania and install in your notes. You can download all the number one hits or your favorite garage bands for $2 each. Well, when you're looking for an independent and dependent variables, you got to think about what don't you know. The two variables we use the most, and again these could change depending on the problem, is we use x and we use y. X, again, usually stands for your independent variable. If you need to underline it, do it. Your dependent is usually your y coordinate. Right? So, as we look at this, we need to define which each of these are. Well, for me, when I look at this, I always try to figure out the dependent variable first. The reason for that is because for me, that's one of the easiest things to find. As I look at this, the dependent variable is what is your final answer, what you're trying to figure out. What do you want to figure out at the end? What do you want to know? Well, when you guys are downloading videos, music, whatever, what do you want to know at the end? Well, it's the cost. You want to know how much it's going to cost you. So your dependent variable, in this case, is the cost. And you're going to find out probably 95% of the time when you're dealing with anything that deals with money, your dependent variable will be a cost. Well, to figure out the cost, you got to figure out, what do I need to know first? Well, you already know what the price of each which each song is. It's $2, and you know that. So what else don't you know? What else you don't know is your independent variable. What do you need to know first? You got to know, to figure out the cost, you have to know how many actual songs you're downloading. So number of songs. If you need to shorthand anything on here, you want to write your own notes, you do what you want. So if you want to write out the word number, do it. It's up to you. I write in shorthand quite a bit, so you'll see this. So your independent variable, what you need to know first is the number of songs. Once you know what that is, you can find the dependent variable, which is the cost, what you want to know at the end. Alright, so look at this. We have to complete this table. As we look at this, x, when we look at a table, your x coordinate will always come over here on the left. X coordinate is always on the left. Alright, in this case, it is number of songs. Alright. The y coordinate is always on the right of the table. Alright. In this case, it's your cost. Alright. So, as we look at this, you need to be able to fill out this table. I know you filled out tables before. Alright, well, let's think about what happens here. If you buy 5 songs, you spend $10 because it's $2 a piece. You buy 6 songs, $12. 7 songs, $14. You buy 10 songs, 20, 15, 30 songs. Alright. So, your independent variable is your x coordinate. Your dependent variable is your y coordinate. So if we look over here and we look at a graph, you need to be able to label this graph. Well, if your number of songs is your x coordinate, that is your x-axis. So your independent variable is always your x-axis. And as we look at this, we've got that right here, number of songs. Your y coordinate, your dependent variable, right, is the cost. So the cost of that dependent variable will always be your y-axis, your vertical axis. So that's very important to remember. You're going to see a lot of questions on that. The independent is your x-axis, the dependent is the y-axis. Now, it wants us to create an expression for above. Well, let's think about what happened here. You bought 5 songs, $10. 6 songs, $12, so on and so forth. So, basically, when you look at this, songs is represented by your independent variable, which is x. And to get the y coordinate, you have to multiply it by the amount of the song, which is $2. So the expression is 2x. Now, when we talk about writing an equation for this, the difference between an expression and an equation. An expression is just a mathematical, sentence. An equation will always have an equal sign in it. An expression will not. That's the only real difference between an expression and an equation. Equation equals, think about that. So when you're writing down the equation for this, we have to include the dependent variable, which is your cost. You want to figure out the value of y. That is what you're trying to find. So that's y. To find it, what you need to know first is the independent variable x, and you have to multiply it times 2. So you end up with y equals 2x. That is the equation for this example. So every time you know the number of songs, you multiply it by 2, you get the cost. All right. So, in other words, in order to find the cost, you need to know the number of songs. So, therefore, cost depends on the number of songs. I'm going to give you a hint here. These are important. Know those phrases. The cost is a function of the number of songs. And lastly, the number of songs determines the cost. All right? Now, I want to make sure you guys see this, because this is going to be important. This is one of the most missed questions on our end of course exam for last year. I know we have the word cost and number of songs in here, but you can also replace any of these words with dependent or independent quantity, so that you can just use this for any situation. But as you look at this, we've already talked about this. The dependent quantity is the cost, your y coordinate. The independent quantity is the number of songs. All right. When you have this depends on statement, we're going to talk about this a little more later. The dependent depends on the independent quantity. When you see the phrase is a function of, it's the same thing. The dependent is a function of the independent quantity. Determines is different. Determines is backwards. The independent quantity determines what the cost is, or your dependent quantity. So remember those phrases. You're going to see those a lot. I mean a lot. All right, so let's look at the next one. So when determining the independent and dependent quantities, what I like to do is I like to underline a few things. First thing is I underline key phrase. When you look at this statement, your grade in Algebra 1 is a function of the time spent preparing for class. If you see that phrase is a function of, you will know that the dependent quantity will come first, the independent quantity will come second. So your grade in Algebra 1 is your dependent quantity. The time spent preparing for class is your independent quantity. I want to make sure that's clear. When you see that is a function of phrase, the dependent is a function of the independent. When we look at the next one, whether we play the game tonight depends on the weather. Well, depends on. If you look at what we did on the first one, or sorry, on the previous section, the depends on statement is the same as is a function of. So what that means is, whether we play the game tonight is your dependent quantity. The dependent depends on the independent. The weather is your independent quantity. So, weather, that is your independent quantity. Whether you play the game is your dependent quantity. Because when you think about the situation, if you're on a team and you play outside, I have to worry about this all the time as a soccer coach. What's my ultimate goal each time we have a game? We want to play it. So what you want to know, so what you're trying to figure out is the dependent variable, which is I want to play the game. So that's what I need to know first, though, is your independent quantity, which is what the weather is. I got to know what the weather is first before I can determine whether I can play the game or not. All right? So let's look at the next one. Amount of snowfall determines the length of the ski season. Key word in there, determines. We have a determined statement. This is the opposite of these two up here. In a determined statement, the amount of snowfall is your independent variable. The length of the ski season is independent, is a dependent variable. So I want to make sure you see that. Determined statement is backwards from the other two. So, amount of snowfall is your independent quantity. The length of the ski season, right, that is your dependent quantity. Right? So, this is something you're going to have to memorize. You're not going to have a cheat sheet or anything like that. You got to memorize these statements. Right? That'll help you out quite a bit. All right, so the next one. You earned 5 cents for each bottle returned to the recycling center. In this example, the key word is words like depends on are not present. So we're going to try to rephrase this into one of those types of situations. There's two quantities that are not obvious, so ask yourself, what depends on what? Okay? So, what are we trying to calculate? What do we want to know? What do we want to know at the end? So if you're collecting bottles, what do you want to know? Right? I want to know how much money I'm going to get back. Right? That's cost. Right? Some people might want to call it the amount of money. Right? But you want to know, if you're getting all these cans, your end game is you want to get money. So I want to know how much I'm going to get back, so the cost that I'm going to get. What do you got to know first? Well, the first thing you have to know, you got to know how many cans that you collected. You got to know that first. If you don't know how many cans you got, you don't know how much money you're going to get. You already know how much it is for each can. You just don't know how many cans there are. So now we have to rephrase this as a depends on statement. As we talked about what depends on. And a depends on statement. The dependent depends on the independent. So, as long as you know what each of those are, you can plug them in pretty simply. The dependent quantity is cost. So the cost depends on the independent quantity, which is your number of cans. All right. Now, as you look at this, I want you to think about number 3 for a second. And when you look at this, I want you to know which graph represents the situation. As you look at these two, it's the same basic thing, they're just backwards. So they're just trying to figure out, do you know which one is your independent, which one's your dependent? Remember what we talked about at the beginning. Your independent quantity is your x-axis. Your dependent quantity is your y-axis. So you need to look to see which one is on your x and y-axis. If you need to label your axis, do so. X, Y. xy. So think about it. Which one is this going to be? Well, independent quantity is number of cans. So that needs to be your x-axis. The dependent quantity is the cost. So I'm hoping that you circle that one. This one is backwards. This is one of the most missed questions on your next test. So be able to identify where the independent and dependent variable goes on a graph. Independent x, dependent y. Alright, and then next, height is a function of a person's age. When you look at this, is that true or false? Think about it. When you are born to where you are now, does your age tell you how tall you will be? Because are you taller when you're 2 years old, or are you taller when you're 15? No? Think about it. This is a true statement. Okay? Now, here's another one. The height is a function of several people's ages. So is your height a function of other people's ages? Hoping that you saw it. No. When you look at this statement is false. It doesn't make any sense. Your height is not dependent upon other people. It depends on your age. That is your justification. Say it again. Your height does not depend on other people. It depends on you only. Alright. So, we have this lovely thing here. Hoping that most of this shows up. I think there is results of might be a little small. I'm going to put it up there so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. Hopefully that's a little bit better so you can see all this. Alright, so as we look at this, you have another sheet of paper. You need to be able to identify using these statements. These statements are depends on, is a function of, determines, is determined by, affects, and is a result of. Depends on statement. We've talked about this already. Depends on variable is the dependent depends on the independent. Always. So this is going to be a nice little cheat sheet for you. Write this on there and you're going to be able to use this later to kind of help yourself out with this. Is a function of is the same. So the dependent variable is a function of the independent variable, x. We talked about determines before. Determines is different from these two. The independent variable determines, the dependent variable. Okay. Now, is determined by. Now, as you can see, it's written differently, and this is where some people get confused. The dependent variable is determined by the independent variable. Now, affects. Think about what affects means. How it affects something. So, the independent variable will affect the dependent variable. And then lastly, is a result of. The nice thing about is a result of, the same as depends on and is a function of. So, it's a dependent variable is a result of the independent variable. Okay? So, basically what it says is, the answer is a result of whatever the beginning was, the independent variable. Alright? Alright. So, lastly, we have some things to plug in here. When we're looking at this, first thing is, on the left side of a table is your x coordinate. Alright? The right side of a table is your y coordinate. So think, what would go over here on the left, and it should be the same number of labels in each line. So when we look at this, on the left side, x is your independent. So what goes with independent? Well, on the y side, it would be your dependent. We'll look at some of these other ones. X, we just talked about that. X coordinate, y coordinate. Okay? Now, from there, let's go on to this one. Input. If you input something in, what should you get? An output. Your output is your dependent variable. Oh. English. Your English class. You have a cause, it creates an effect. Cause and effect. Cause is your independent variable, effect is your dependent variable. So you got to know the cause first before you can figure out the effect. If something happens, then something else will happen. So, if and then. Now the most important one, which I probably should have put up there for you, you're going to see this one a lot, especially next week. Domain. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. That's your x coordinate, your independent variable. Range is your y. Okay? So, x-axis, y-axis is your independent variable, your dependent variables. All of these could be here underneath independent variable, your x-axis. All of these could represent your dependent variable, which is your y-axis. Right? When written as an ordered pair, we write x and y. We talked about that with our coordinate plane review. So, hopefully you're able to see all that. Again, if you have any questions about this, make sure you ask me about it. Right? Alright. So, if you need more time to copy it down, pause it, look at it. I'm here in the mornings if you need help. Alright, you guys. Hope you have a good day. See you tomorrow.